you hear me out there? Everybody? Okay. Thank you, thank you. I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It's going to be quite an experience for me, and I hope for you too. This is the How 9/11 Changed American Journalism, being brought to you by the IU Alumni Association and Belisario Alumni Association. So we'd like to welcome you and hope that we can make this a beautiful experience for all of us. The idea of this program was to discuss the events of September 11, 2001. This discussion, following 20 years and 2 weeks after that fateful day, hopefully will let these three distinctive individuals thrill us with their stories of their experiences, their lessons, and the realities of what it's like to cover themes of patriotism, international affairs, terrorism, politics, and beyond in this day and based on what happened since that 2001. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll start from my left and go to my left here. So this is immediately to my left, the Honorable Mary Beth Long. She joins us tonight with a distinguished career of governmental and business experience. I was trying to distinguish which to highlight when I presented her, because there's quite a headache trying to figure out. So I chose historical first. So Professor Long is Professor of Practice at the School of International Affairs here at Penn State. She served as the first woman ever confirmed to a 4-star equivalent position by the U.S. Senate as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for the International Security Affairs under then U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. In that role, she was responsible for Israel and the rest of the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. She also was the first female to chair NATO's senior-most nuclear and missile defense policy-making body, the high-level group. Among her many business adventures, she's the founder and principal of M.B. Long and Associates, PLLC, and co-founder and principal of Global Alliance Advisors, LLC. She serves as an advisor to several Fortune 500 companies and also has advised several presidential candidates. She appears regularly on BBC, CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera English, and the NPR networks on issues of Middle East and the intelligence community. She's a licensed lawyer who is an honors graduate of Penn State, magna cum laude. Professor Long is a Distinguished Alumni Award from the university in 2016. She also holds a JD degree from Washington and Lee University School of Law. Professor Long. Our next guest here is Jerry Schwartz. He's currently serving as an editor-at-large for the Associated Press, handling major projects and features. Jerry's been with the AP since his 1977 graduation from Penn State with degrees in journalism and history. A former Daily Collegian editor-in-chief, Jerry has worked for the AP in New York as a reporter and editor. He is the author of the Associated Press Reporting Handbook, published by McGraw-Hill, and has contributed the chapter on disasters to the 2007 history, Breaking News, How the Associated Press Has Covered War, Peace, and Everything Else. Jerry is also a member of the team that edits the AP Style book, Jerry Schwartz. And bringing this table to a whole, Scott Dodd is a national editor at the New York Times, which he describes as his most important job since being managing editor of the Daily Collegian. At the Times, he has helped cover everything from coronavirus pandemic to the January 6th Capitol riot to the catastrophic wildfires and hurricanes. He has also worked in magazines and digital media. Before joining the Times, Scott was a local newspaper reporter for many years and worked at the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina on that day, 9/11/2001. Scott Dodd.
Honorable or distinguished.
Okay, so what we thought we'd do to start this conversation, and since this is about the September 11 attacks, I thought where we start was if each of you would give us a quick hit of where you were on that day and how the event has affected your careers and your lives.
Well, I had just left CIA after just short of 13 years as a case officer, and I was sitting in the law firm of Williamson Connolly getting ready to go to, literally the next day, to go litigate against Aon, which is a large insurer, and they were one of the occupants of several of the floors in one of the towers. And someone came in and turned us and said, "Oh my gosh, the towers are falling." And we turned on the television and we watched Aon's tower just go completely to the floor. So I went to my office and made a phone call and decided to return to government service about an hour afterwards. So that's where I was, getting ready to go to court.
I was a national writer for the Associated Press at the time, and I generally, in fact, always have gone to work early. It's an easier commute from New Jersey to New York, and I was able to ease into my day without bosses and other nuisances. So I was sitting at my desk at 8:47 when the first plane hit the World Trade Center. And this is obviously a huge story, but nobody knew what was going on. I had an aunt who was in the Empire State Building in 1945 when an Air Force plane struck that building, which was at the time the world's tallest building. And that was an accident. But then a few minutes later, when the second one hit, we knew it wasn't an accident. The next thing I knew, the managing editor had me by the elbow and was pulling me into the national desk, local desk area to write the story. I spent the day writing lead after lead for a while. It was totally chaotic in the sense that we really didn't have, I mean, if you think about it, who would have ever even imagined that something like this could happen? I mean, the wildest and greatest news stories are the ones that you just don't see coming. So I was writing the story for several leads. I was pulled over off to write write a reconstruction of what happened as it was happening, because we were only learning about the plane that hit the Pentagon and then the one that hit Shanksville as I'm writing the reconstruction of something that was already unimaginable. At one point during this, I wrote a sentence that recalled the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And I said, it seemed that the World Trade Center was ground zero once again. And this was the first time anybody wrote that. Now, it's one of these things where you think, wow, you coined a brilliant phrase. At the time, it was just a sentence. It was nothing that, I didn't think it was especially brilliant. I didn't even give it a second thought. I grew up in a time when people remember Hiroshima, and that was ground zero for the atomic bomb. So it was just a sentence, but it became inevitable, and eventually it became a catchphrase. I went back to writing the story, the AM's version. Most of you are too young to remember the time when there were afternoon and morning newspapers. But the early leads were for afternoon newspapers, and then you took all the material to write the AM's story, the important story for morning newspapers, and I did that. And in fact, I can guarantee you that my byline appeared in more newspapers than any of us has ever seen that day. As to how it changed my life going forward, it changed my life a lot for the next few months because that's all we wrote about. But going forward, it was another story, a huge story, maybe the biggest story I ever was involved with, but there are other stories, and we're still writing them.
Unlike Jerry, I was a local news reporter on 9/11. I was still fairly early in my career. I was working at the Charlotte Observer at the time in North Carolina. And as the planes went into the towers, everybody was worried about sort of where's next, what's next, and particularly once planes hit the Pentagon and then one went down in Shanksville, there was concern that this was going to happen all over the country, that the planes were going to be plowing into everything. So Charlotte is one of the largest banking centers in the country, and had the Bank of America Tower, which is the largest skyscraper there. And so they evacuated it because they were afraid that it was next. And so I was reporting on that during the course of the day. North and South Carolina are also home to some of the largest military bases in the country, and they were all mobilizing and locking down and figuring out what was going on. So I was reporting these local stories while this big national story was happening in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania. And there were times when I didn't even really know what was going on nationally. Like, I didn't realize that the towers had fallen till maybe like half an hour afterward, because I was so focused on the reporting that I was doing on the local story and things like that. And that's sort of, I think, the way it played out for a lot of journalists around the country who were not there in New York and Washington, who were doing the local stories and reporting on, you know, just how people were processing and dealing with this all over the place. One of the stories that I wrote that day was about family members who, you know, had loved ones who were in the Twin Towers or in the Pentagon and couldn't reach them because half the cellular phone infrastructure for the East Coast was on the World Trade Center. And so when it went down, all the cell phones went out, no one could get a hold of anybody or anything like that. So they were just waiting to find out if their loved ones were alive or not. Then eventually they did send me to Washington because we didn't have a Washington reporter at the time. We were between correspondents. So I ended up covering recovery efforts at the Pentagon, President Bush's big speech to Congress after that, and a lot of the things that happened in Washington. But it was always sort of with that local perspective and how it was affecting the community that I covered.
So I thought we'd take this conversation into kind of aspects of big picture and little picture kinds of things. So we started off with my big picture thing, and it's just the issue was how and what has happened since in terms of, let's talk about international affairs and the subject of terrorism. I think they're intertwined here very much so, and how journalism has reacted and or changed as a result in that subject matter.
Well, I think the changes made in journalism, I would say, are, from the strategic sense, are not that different than the changes made in most of our very large institutions and our cultural change. And I think part of that is realizing that we're vulnerable. I mean, for the first time, the United States was attacked at home in an incredibly difficult and gory and impacting everyone way. And journalists and journalism changed instantly. People were mobilized at the Department of Defense. People were going downrange. People were talking about Islam. They wanted to understand why these people did what they did. Who were these people? What did that mean about America and our vulnerabilities? People were going downrange. Amazing, heroic journalists were getting on the airplanes with our men and women in uniform and embedding in some of the most dangerous, most difficult areas and really risking their lives every single day to understand who are these people, why do they hate us, is there something we can do about that, how did we end up in this situation not knowing that these people were out there and being so vulnerable, are we safe, when's it going to happen again, how do we keep it from happening again, and is what America is doing downrange appropriate? So for a while, everybody rallied and were very, very patriotic. You would see journalists and news anchors with the United States flag on their lapel, on their jewelry. People did not ask tough questions except for how we got there. There was this almost this underpinning. If I had been in these gentlemen's shoes, and I'd be interested, there was almost this unifying sense of patriotism, of sympathy and empathy, and even our enemies said, how can we help? And woe to, I think, the producer who's going to say, wait a second, are we partly responsible for this? Or no one wanted to appear unpatriotic for a long time. And then, actually, I think journalists even said, we're going to be hard hitting. We're going to do more objective reporting. We need to dig deeper. How did we miss the fact that the whole wide world of Islam, or not, had an issue with us? And what is motivating these people? And is it just these people, or are we missing a big undercurrent? So I think there was, in many cases, this doubling down of we need to be better. We're going to be deeper reporters. We're going to be more in depth, so that we're going to play a role as the fourth domain, but we're also going to educate in some respects. I think that's changed back though, and I'll leave it to the gentleman here.
I think you're exactly right, but I think I would also point out that the whole argument that we were in Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction in the wake of September 11th, a lot of people, for that very reason that you were talking about, the patriotism, the national surge that followed September 11th, a lot of journalists bought in. There were always people who were asking questions, but those people were not necessarily at the forefront. Sometimes they were over the side. And I think, as you suggest, I think that there was a backlash to that eventually, because the weapons of destruction, so mass destruction, were not found. And people began to ask, were we sold a bill of goods? And I think that you see that ever since, to some degree, that it contributed not only to journalists and their doubts about whether they're being told the truth about a lot of these things, but the public as well. So I think that it is kind of stuck. The ripples are still there. Whether there's been a backlash to the backlash, I don't know if I see it, but it's possible.
I think that the entire, my entire generation of journalists was sort of shaped by 9/11 as sort of a big formative story that we covered. And I really think until COVID, there was nothing that sort of compared to that. And so I think that there a lot of the lessons of the way that we covered 9/11 and things like that really did sort of shape our thinking about what a big story should be. And it often felt like it was this external threat that came in. And in some ways that caused us, I think, to miss some of the internal threats, to miss some of the big economic and cultural and structural changes that were happening in the United States, and that now are playing out in a lot of different ways. I don't want to suggest that was everyone, but I think it had a big influence over the way the media thought about what the big story really was, and sort of what the threat out there that we needed to be wary of was.
Can I ask you a question? In government, do you think that reflects really the way government went at it, looking at the external threats and not paying much attention to the internal threats?
I think so, and not just the internal threats, but also there was a glossing over of the internal problems that got us there. I mean, the irony of all of this is that in 2008 and 9, I was the person that was responsible for getting rid of the enriched uranium that finally was found. And the decision was made that wouldn't be a story because the country had moved on. But I think you're right. You actually raised a question that I was wondering. Do you think that if 9/11 happened tomorrow, would the coverage from the press be better or worse, or different? If you don't mind me
No,
jumping
listen,
in.
no, we're going in the right direction here.
Do you want to take that first, or shall I?
I mean, it would be very different, in part because, Jerry talked about the idea that we have that, 20 years ago, we had morning editions and afternoon editions. And now we have every second editions, basically, at the Times, I work a lot on live coverage of events, and those can be big national things, whether it's the Capitol riots, whether was the George Floyd protests last year, things like that, or they can be local things like shootings or wildfires, that sort of thing. And we've really transformed the way that we cover things so that we are sort of writing about them, updating them continuously, and not just plucking a story down at the end of the day that goes into the print edition of the newspaper that winds up on the doorstep the next morning. And there's both good and bad about that. But when you think about what the coverage of 9/11 would be like today, it wouldn't be Jerry getting the opportunity to write that first afternoon story, process things, and then write that next morning story. It would be scores of journalists every minute trying to process and update what's going on and things like that. And it would be consumers following that very differently. And I think it just makes a huge difference in terms of how we process our news.
I would add, I added a story, or kind of edited a story recently by our media writer. And it was a 20th anniversary story about the three anchormen, and they were all men and they were all white, who were kind of the nation's gatekeepers, seers, whatever you want to call them, the anchormen for ABC, CBS, and NBC, and a good chunk of America followed the events of the day through their eyes, through their words, and their pictures, obviously. That's not true anymore. There is no central place where people go for their news the way they did 20 years ago. I would be very curious to know what would happen today if there was something like that, when a good chunk of you, all of you, get your news in a pixelated or fragmented way. It comes from social media, from any one of a number of sources, some of them good, a lot of them not so good. And in a world where I don't think you would see the kind of unified focus that we saw 20 years ago, and how that would affect everything going forward is a good question. I don't have the answer for that.
But that is what we're trying to get to. Scott, it would be disfranchised. Everybody be all over the place covering it. Will and have we learned as media how to break through that conundrum and get the news out that we need to tell these stories?
I mean, I think we clearly haven't. If you look at, coverage of some of the biggest stories of the past few years, whether it's, the Trump election, whether it's COVID-19, there are different realities out there for, consumers of news and information. And because it's so fragmented, because it's so pixelated, people could choose which of those pieces they want to attach reality to. Certainly there were 9/11 truthers. There were people who doubted that what happened actually happened, thought it was an inside job, things like that. But I feel like that was a very small fragment of society. Nowadays, the people who don't believe what anything that the other half of society believes, it's just, it's huge. And I think it's a real obstacle that we haven't quite figured out how to deal with yet.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because you raised an issue that you triggered me, and I'm going to be a little bit provocative. as the person who almost always was the senior government official behind the scenes, never with my name attached, and even now, I have no one to blame me.
All right, good.
And even now I deal with journalists almost, at least weekly, if not others, almost daily. I think one of the results, and this isn't unique to journalism, but it's, since that's what we're talking about, of the transformation of technology and how we all consume our information is that because there's this constant feed, this cacophony, I think two things have happened. There's not time to identify, research, hone the good journalist piece, and then report. That a lot of times it's backwards. It's report because you got to meet the next guy. You're on literally an every second cycle. And what we're finding in at least some cases, that the rush to get information out isn't what I understood under Professor Nichols to be real news versus just information, number one. Number two, I think, to the shame of all of us, that journalism and media has gone by way of our culture in that it's divisive. I mean, if as the senior U.S. official sitting on the airplane with the Secretary of Defense every day, we briefed everybody the same, he would leave and then I would answer the questions to try to really get everything out. But they don't do that anymore because of the perceived politicization of the information or the real politics involved. You know, you've got, you know, is MSNBC really gonna get the same thing Fox is getting, and is Fox really better or worse than the Epic Times, or God forbid that Mother Jones would be in the room, and that is a tremendous disservice to your generation, I think, and it's not unique to journalism.
Well, there's another aspect to that too. 20 years ago, there were more mainstream, heavily reported sources. The Chicago Tribune had a really good Washington bureau. The Baltimore Sun had foreign bureaus all around the world. There are fewer and fewer of us out there, and we're relying on you and us and very few others to bear the burden. And I mean, you guys are doing pretty well. I'm sure you're seeing that in your paycheck too, right? But we're struggling. And I mean, one of the things I remember very clearly about that story, the AM story, where I gathered everything together, is we had Osama bin Laden as a key suspect in all this in that story, which was ready at like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. That was because we had the resources, we had people calling people like you, and so many other people, and we were able to put together a piece that still stands 20 years later. The resources to do that are not what they were. We can still do that, you guys can still do it, but there are fewer of us who can do it.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who, as I said, spent a lot of time in local journalism and, cared very much about telling stories of local communities and things like that. I mean, I'm very happy to be an editor on the national desk at the New York Times, but I'm very sad to see what has happened at the kind of places that I used to work at, because I know that there's a lot going on in those communities that is unreported, underreported, and those communities are ill-served. I mean, the idea that there are news deserts in this country, like places where, there is just not a local outlet to cover them anymore. It's sort of unthinkable in a place that used to, have, every small town had like not just one paper, but multiple papers and things like that. It's nice to work for one of the winners. I mean, I'm very happy to be there. But the state of journalism, particularly local journalism, is a big concern. And then as Jerry says, it matters that like fewer and fewer of us are able to put reporters in other places around the world and to be able to bring that news back. I mean, I think you should all read the New York Times. I think you should all subscribe to the New York Times. But I wish there were many other good sources out there for you to rely on as well.
And in that same vein, I do want to get into local a little bit later in the conversation, but let's talk about in the big picture situation right now. Beth mentioned the fact that the bigger operations that do have people out there, are you really doing the job? Let's look at some of the subjects out there. We talked about international terrorism per se, but let's talk internal terrorism. Are you guys covering that subject? And I also want to look at the military. Is the military a subject that is being covered by, I'm going to pick up the media, you big media types right now for a minute. Are you covering the military? What are we doing right and wrong about our coverage of the military? And let's look at terrorism. So those two topics alone. Where do you go?
Thank you.
Thank you. Are we doing as well as we should? No. And I think part of that is because we don't even have the resources we did 20 years ago. We have really great people covering those things, but these are big subjects. These are big and sometimes very amorphous subjects. To get out ahead of the reality, to get out ahead, for example, should we have been surprised by January 6th last year? Should we have been surprised that something like that would happen? We all were. Well, I can't say we all were, but I think a lot of us were. And I think that's a failure, a failure of journalism, among other things. Some stories are a lot easier to cover than others. Some are black and white. 2 buildings in Manhattan falling because planes hit them. That's an easy story to cover. But as you suggest, finding out why it happened, how it came to happen, that's a bigger story. Have we gotten better at telling those bigger stories that are in the background? I don't think so. I think we're always trying. But I can't say that we're much better at it than we were 20 years ago.
I mean, I'll say, again, as a representative of the Times, we've done some really good coverage of white nationalism. We've done some really good coverage of today's military. We continue to do, I think, the best foreign reporting in the business. But I think, in some ways, the stories have gotten harder. They've gotten more complex. They're more interconnected and things like that. I don't know that, even with our resources, that we can do it all. And that is sort of the problem of when you're relying on a few, yes, large and powerful, but still a few national sources to be able to do that kind of reporting, as opposed to like my news advisor when I was here at the Daily Collegian. She had worked for a local Pennsylvania paper and did a really great series of stories on the power of the Ku Klux Klan in central Pennsylvania, and how it still had a lot of influence even into the 80s and 90s over local politics and things like that. There's so much less of that kind of reporting than there used to be. And those are the stories that add up to the big story of how we get to January 6th. And I think that's really hard.
Oh, please.
I actually have a story that relates to this, if you don't mind, in a good way. Well, number one, I wanted to raise the point that it's not just the domestic resources, which these gentlemen have, and you alluded a moment ago. The way our media resources abroad have been, they were the first cuts. And it broke my heart to see really good journalists and really good newspapers and other media outlets. The first thing they did was slash their international presence because it's expensive and you lost a lot of expertise in that area. Second, no one's benefited more than the great relationship between the military and the media. it really is one of mutual respect. So much, though, that I will tell a story on ourselves a little bit. There was a point in time when we were selling weapons to an foreign power that probably would have upset Israel quite a bit. And everyone was really scratching their heads, why is this happening? And some amazing journalists who are still covering international things today figured it out. They guessed what the real reason was that allowed the political masters to agree to yes. And they called and asked the media folk at the Pentagon to confirm or deny. We couldn't confirm and we couldn't deny. And our media, these journalists were so patriotic that they allowed us to call them in, close the door, and for me to explain to them why their guess was going to cost lives without telling them that they were right. And guess what? They didn't write the story. In retrospect, they absolutely did the right thing, and it really did save lives. In retrospect, I do occasionally see a respect for the military because you need them as a source impede really tough questions, particularly lately when one could argue under various administrations, have you politicized the military? And do you have your priorities straight? And what happened to all those injured men and women who came back from Afghanistan, who are still committing suicide, or who have been on opioids and painkillers? And was there a drug problem even beforehand? Those questions were never asked. I think in part of the love relationship between the military and journalism. So it works on both sides.
I would just add that I think Afghanistan was a forgotten war by so many people. We wrote those stories about Iraq a lot more than we did about Afghanistan. You could argue all kinds of reasons why that's true, but I don't think there's any doubt that it is true.
We're not gonna solve these problems tonight, but at least I just want to make sure that we address them all. A lot of the questioning, I guess, comes back to the internet and social media. Are there in the roles? And Scott talked about how we're just churning out. Jerry, you talked about this. We're just churning out copy all day long and not really doing the perspective. Is that doing the public justice? Is that doing media itself a justice with this the constant churn?
I would say we do have to be careful that we don't sort of like romanticize like the old days and things like that, because the churn can be good. Like we can do good work in that way. To think about like a completely different anniversary story. I wrote a story about the 20th anniversary of the bombing of the Marine Barracks in Beirut. I remember going back and reading that coverage, and I think that happened on like a Tuesday afternoon. And it was probably by, I think it was it wasn't until like the Sunday paper that you started to have a good idea of what really happened there, like sort of the reconstruction of the day, who had messed up, like that sort of thing. Maybe that was okay, but I think that, by 9/11, we were starting to do that, within hours. Now we're starting to do it within minutes or seconds to try and do that type of analysis and smart reporting and things like that. And it can happen alongside the reporting of the news. The problem is it doesn't happen every place, and not everyone is putting the same resources into both of those things. I think it's, that's why we need to seek out the sources that are able to do that, willing to do that, and have the resources and ability to do that.
And I would add that to some degree, what you're seeing in social media, what you're seeing, the kind of work that Scott's talking about, the wire services always have done this. We're always a deadline every minute. that on September 11th, I may be wrong, and I probably should have looked this up before I came here, but I believe we did 141 leads that day for the main story. And that's an incremental story being built. As we learned things, as the story came into focus, so did our story extend and expand and build out. I mean, my name was on all of them, but I didn't write, I wrote a fraction of them. I had rewrite people working on them and people all over the country and the world contributing to them. So to some degree, it's not a question of the speed or the digesting bits of the story and putting it out. The question is doing it well. And I think if we do it well, we're doing everybody a service.
Yeah, the look on my face is, I hate to interrupt the love fest, but I am going to be provocative. I'm very much a critic of exactly that. There has to be a distinction between, in my world, there has to be a distinction between social media and the white noise of the uninformed and of the greatly informed, but they're not the media. The media, in my world, has a role, and that is the fourth pillar of our democracy. And whether a media has to accept that responsibility, otherwise they might as well be social media. You might as well have a streaming consciousness. I mean, there's a really incredible accountability for me as an individual. I want the media to protect me from my government, from my overseers, from those who have the control of my life. And that means not just vomiting information. And I think we've started because of the press of information, and no one wants to miss the big story. And because of the press of the financial ratings, you got to be the guy who gets the most ratings. Well, the guy who gets the most ratings is not writing 1 or 2 stories a week, and he's not the in-depth analysis guy who's really studying white supremacy. I mean, we're all talking about white terrorism. Well, how many guys have died because of white terrorism in the last year? I don't know. How many died of black terrorism in the last year? I don't know. But we're sure going to cover the demonstration and the this and the that. And is that really a service to the country? I don't think so. I can get that off the social media. What I want from journalism is the investigate, analyze, report. Not report, analyze, and investigate to make sure I was right, or moving on to the next story. And I know that's provocative, but we're having way too much love. So I throw it out there.
Yeah, where's the love? I'm not disagreeing with you, but I do think that there's a place for just giving people the basic facts of what happened. And we have to do that before we get to an analysis of why and how. I mean, we knew on September 11th, 2001 that something had happened, but for a long time, it was so out of focus. I remember sitting there in the newsroom, and they said, it came down. And we said, what? He said, it came down. I said, what came down? The building. What, not the building. I mean, and all you saw on television was debris and the mist and the fog. And in a weird way, it's a weird metaphor for the story. Because this was a huge thing. And in order to explain what happened, you had to say what happened. You had to find out what happened. And then we can get to the other issues. I'm not saying we shouldn't get to the other issues. I think they're just as important in the long run as reporting what happened that day when it was happening.
I think we're talking past each other a little bit.
To some degree we are.
Yeah, because I think that investigation has to happen as well to report the facts, because we get the facts wrong so many times, or we realize there are facts and then there are facts and your facts and counterfacts and unfacts. What was the thing President Trump called him?
Trump or which
He had this
he's
weird
a lot of
approach
stuff.
to the facts that many people took issue with. But in any event, I don't think in the military and in CIA you learn that the first facts you learn are almost always wrong, because they're too fast and they're usually from a dubious source, or they're one-sided, or you can't put them in context. So they aren't facts, they're just information. And I worry that we're moving so fast that's what we're reporting, just information, not facts.
I think I can kind of summarize this. I think the term is that if everybody's churning, no one's sitting back. And I think that's getting back to what Scott was talking about. The locals used to gin the stories that the higher ups used to pick up. And there's nobody in the local ranks anymore. And everybody that can put out today is trying to stay in a 24/7 cycle. So that loss is there. And I think that's good. But let me get back to, we've churned up enough here that let's say one of the outflows of the coverage of 9/11 was that we raised this backlash and racism issue of Muslims and the domino effect of how it has affected the Muslim community, the Asian community, and black folks have always been saying they were getting the short end of the deal. Has the media learned this lesson in that regard?
I certainly think that there's a lot of awareness among the media of that backlash that you're talking about. I think there was a lot of coverage around the anniversary of that. Elizabeth Diaz for our paper wrote a great story about how 9/11 impacted Muslims around the country. I can't speak, I'll say part of the problem is when we talk about the media is a gigantic beast, I can speak for the people that I work with and the people that I know and what we try to do and things like that. And I think there is a much greater understanding of needing to put things in context, to make sure that the way that we report on things does not have negative impacts on any number of communities and things like that. Do we get that right all the time? Probably not, but I think it is something that we talk about and analyze and try to deal with to a much greater extent than we probably did 20 years ago. But again, I'm speaking for a very narrow slice of what we consider the media.
See, I think the media get a bad rap on a lot of this, because I too remember the stories we wrote about. Remember the Sikh gas station attendants that were attacked in the wake of September 11th? Most of you wouldn't know about this, but there was this insane backlash against anybody who was perceived as being Muslim. And we reported that, and we reported a lot of this stuff, and certainly not in a laudatory way. But let's take a look back, not 20 years back, but a year back. Look at the attacks on the Asians in this country. That wasn't because of the media. Whatever happened in a lot of that is you have to look into the American soul for that, or the soul of some Americans anyway. I don't think it was the media.
Are we looking into that soul?
Yeah, we're trying.
I don't know, what is soul?
Okay, we're going on a different direction here.
Qualified on this panel to analyze soul.
One of the I thought was one of the great developments in journalism after 9/11 was we started producing what we called I call them the Porches of Grief. Never have we seen that much death in such a short time, and every major, especially in the New York area, all the newspapers were going out of their way to try to find out and write little profiles of each person that died when the buildings came down. And these it's kind of, you see it today now. Every time there's a big incident, the media operations go out of their way to try to give a portrait of the person who has been killed, especially in situations like this. Those portraits sent a lot of reporters out covering and writing about, and this is getting into their souls. They were very affected by each one of the stories they wrote. So much affected they mentally, they couldn't do the job. Do you see anything about going on in terms of us becoming more kind of heartfelt and looking out for our people in the business now, because that shook up a lot of newsrooms.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, you know, the desk that I work on, we cover a lot of shootings, a lot of disasters, a lot of death, you know, and destruction. And I think we are much more aware of the impact that has on the journalists and the reporters, and the need to give people breaks, to be aware of people's mental health, to understand what they can handle and things like that. That it is not really, you know, a mark of virtue to be able to walk through these stories and just brush it off and not have it like affect you anymore. So, you know, we even are at the point sometimes in our meetings where something bad happens, and we look back at, well, who covered the last 3 of these bad things? Let us not put that person on this story. Let's give them a break. Let's, you know, like put other people in there, you know, have a rotation, have, you know, whatever it is, and be mindful of, you know, when people show the signs of the strain and things like that. And that's not something that I think people had a lot of consideration for, like when I got into the business. And I do think it came exactly from that, from sort of like, you know, we've put a much greater focus on victims, which I think is great, but that reporting is really hard, and being aware of that and dealing with that is something that I think we are doing a better job at. We're probably doing a much better job than we did, but we're getting better.
Yeah, I agree. First of all, I should say that Porches of Grief was one of the most wonderful journalism projects I think I've ever seen. The Times did that better than anybody I've ever seen, and a lot of people have done it since. We had the same issues. I don't date them back to September 11th so much as the mass shootings that have happened over the last few years. I think those have been the ones that really struck. And we've had the same conversations about not overloading people with these things, because you tend to have your go-to guys, you know, the people who can do the job and do it right. We don't have that many of them, and we tend to rely on them, and it can be harmful. I had a conversation with a wonderful reporter of ours who was in New Zealand for the Christchurch shootings. And I don't know if you guys paid much attention to it, but the shooter videotaped what he did. And in doing a reconstruction, remember I told you about the reconstruction story I did on September 11th? Well, to do the reconstruction story, this reporter watched the video again and again and again. And you can imagine what that did to her. She came back to from New Zealand on home leave, and I sat down with her, and she burst out crying. This was months and months later, maybe even a year later. And you know what? It's just not worth it. It's just not worth it to have people do that. It verges on violence porn. You know, we don't need to know every juncture of people shooting each other. You know, we can tell people enough that they can understand what happened without doing that, and without subjecting our people to that. And so that's one of the things we decided, that we're not going to do that. There were a lot of other decisions. We had the Dodd Center, which is a group that actually specializes in this and is going into newsrooms and talking about this with them. And they came to us, and we've been working out some plans how we're going to handle this in terms of talking to families, who we do, what we do, and it's, you know, it's a tough thing, but it's something we have to deal with.
You mentioned we'll go back to the discussion about the local press and the resources that are being affected by the local presses. There's been this new thing in coverage, community coverage, coming up with these news co-ops and people reporting. This is not necessarily a reflection of what happened after 9/11, but it is a kind of result of where journalism is going. Any thoughts on what you know? You guys, you're set. But when we look out in State College and I'm trying to get news out here, it's impossible to find news out here. What do we as communities do to try to get this news back out there? What do you think about these co-ops and public reporting projects that are going on?
man, if I could solve the problems of local journalism, I would not be, you know, I would be much higher up in this industry than I am. But I do think, as you say, there are a lot of people who are trying to find creative solutions to the lack of local news. I have a friend in Charlotte who was a longtime business reporter at The Observer, who started a newsletter, you know, a daily newsletter to cover business stories. And it started off as just him, and then he added a second person, and now he has a lot of people like freelancing for him and things like that. And it's been really successful because if you do it well, people are hungry for it. And he's found a completely different model now. You know, he used to be funded by a newspaper, and now he's funded directly by his readers. You know, and there are experiments like that all over the country, and some are succeeding, and hopefully some can scale up. There are things like Report for America, which is, you know, a nonprofit that raises money to be able to put reporters in newsrooms that have lost them and to cover issues that wouldn't be covered otherwise. You know, do we need more of those? Yeah, but I think there's a lot of people out there who are trying to figure this out, and I think some of them are starting to get traction and succeed.
Yeah, on the other hand, I heard the other day about a billionaire who's about to drop like $25 million on a plan to a foundation that would cover a major American city. What does it say about us that we're depending on the largesse of billionaires to tell us the news that we really need to know? I mean, if people aren't willing to pay for this, if it comes down to a charity, what does it say about us more generally? And is that sustainable? I don't know. I mean, the things you're talking about are intriguing. Like what's going on in Colorado is really very intriguing. And there are other things too, but I don't know.
But I do think that part of it is trying to find ways to rebuild trust between media organizations and their readers, which we've lost in some ways for an entire variety of reasons. But by focusing more, again, I think on that community coverage, on the issues that are really important to people and that matter, and doing it in a responsible way, you know, I have to hope that can be successful, because I think that's what we do need.
Well, now, we're getting at that point. I'm getting a funny look from the side of the room. Before I let you guys go, I gotta ask you one thing. If you had, looking in the audience here, and they're all looking at you and they're looking for advice here, what would you tell them is ahead for them? Any advice? You want to, just get a 30 seconds.
So I had a head start because I was asked this question in a class I visited earlier today, so I had already thought about it. You know, the pathway that I took through journalism, starting at a small outlet, moving up to a medium-sized outlet, you know, eventually like making it to the Times, that pathway, it's not available, you know, in nearly as many forms because of some of the problems that we've been talking about. But, you know, I was able to succeed because I got to work in newsrooms with really smart people, starting at the Collegian and you know, moving all the way up. And I think there are opportunities like that out there. They're just different than the opportunities that I had, maybe. And so, you know, my advice would be for anyone who is making career decisions about where am I going to go, what's my first job after college going to be, and things like that. It is to look for places that will teach you, that will give you opportunities to learn, that will give you opportunities to grow, and not places that will just expect you to jump in, you know, feet first, and not have any sort of a net or anybody there to help you or train you. Because sometimes that can seem like a more glamorous or prestigious thing, but it's not going to take you very far.
Jerry.
I'm going to be more big picture in a weird way. I worked for one organization in one city for 44 years next month. I can guarantee you, all of you, none of you will have that kind of career. Because there's a good chance that wherever you end up will not be there in 44 years. I will, however, say that I've got something akin to blind faith that you guys will figure it out. That somehow you will be able to do, because what we do is really too important not to do it. So there needs to be some way to do it. And you guys are the ones who are going to figure it out. Not me. I'll be retired by then. Happily, I will. But it'll be you guys who are going to do it. And the thing you need to do is put one foot in front of the other and follow his advice, basically. Like I said, find the places, find where you can get mentorship, find where you can do the work that you want to do, and then do it. And somehow it'll work out.
From the outsider looking in, tell us.
From the outside looking in, from a 9/11 national security, foreign affairs perspective, 2 points. With all the criticisms that you give our journalists and our media, we have the best journalists and media in the world, bar none. We have total freedom. We don't dominate our media with the government. It is truly independent. And it is a privilege and a joy for all of you. I hope if you work there, please keep it that way because we slide around a lot. Second, unfortunately, the media and journalism in particular isn't going to serve you well for the next 9/11. We don't have anybody downrange. We don't have anybody looking at hard questions. And to the extent that threat comes from outside, and I believe it will when it comes to an existential threat, we're clueless and we're depending on other media organizations. So be that person to really ask hard questions. But most importantly, and these gentlemen said it best, my career advice to you is find something you're passionate about in journalism and do it. Do it really well. And as long as you're happy, you know what, you will advance in the most important way. So good luck.
I apologize that we couldn't get questions from the audience because of the situation in hand. But if you would help me and join me in thanking our panelists.